A Book of Fairy Tales. Puss in Boots. Once upon a time there was a miller who had 3 sons. When he died, he left the mill to his eldest son, his donkey to his second son, and while to his youngest son John he left a cat. The 2 eldest brothers now worked as partners, but they did not want the youngest to join them at all. "What use is a cat?" they scoffed. "Why should we share with you?" John was wandering sadly away when he heard a voice behind him. "Master," it said. Turning, John saw his cat looking up at him with wise green eyes. "A talking cat!" gasped John. "Yes, if you will only buy me a pair of smart boots, I will make your fortune," answered the cat. Now John had very little money to spend on anything and was hoping to buy himself some supper. But he decided to trust what his cat said. So off he went to the bootmaker and purchased the most beautiful little pair of black top boots with smart red heels. Puss was delighted. The boots fitted him perfectly. Then, standing on his hind legs, he marched up and down, looking as if he had worn boots all his life. "Thank you, master," purred Puss. "Now you wait here for me. I'm off to make you rich." First, Puss took a big sack which he filled with cabbage leaves. Then, with a swish of his thick furry tail, he was away down the road. Soon Puss left the road and ran across the fields until he came to a rabbit warren. There, creeping very quietly, he propped his sack open and hid himself. Soon some inquisitive rabbits were sniffing round the sack. A large, greedy rabbit pushed the others aside, and hopping into the open sack, started to gobble up the cabbages. Sly Master Puss, who had been watching carefully, quickly pulled tight the string he had tied round his sack. After killing the rabbit with merciful swiftness, Puss lifted the sack onto his shoulder and marched straight to the royal palace. Now it happened that His Majesty the King's very favorite dish was fresh rabbit pie. Clever Puss knew this and helped to get an audience with His Majesty. "I must think up a grand name for my master," mused Puss. "Ah, I have it! The Marquis of, let me see, Carabas. That has a nice purr in it. The Marquis of Carabas." At first Puss was afraid he might have some difficulty getting past the guards. In fact, the soldiers were so astonished to see a cat walking by on his hind legs, and wearing boots too, that they let him past without question. "Must be some new joke of the court pages," remarked the captain of the guard, and he escorted Puss to the king himself. Here Master Puss swept His Majesty the most elegant bow, and laid the rabbit before him. "A gift, your Majesty, from my dear master, the noble Marquis of Carabas," said Puss. A talking cat! The king was astonished. The captain of the guard was amazed. His Majesty's page was wide-eyed, and His Majesty's little dog could not believe his long curly ears. But kings are too polite to stare for long. "Ha! Fresh rabbit pie! I shall have it tonight. Delicious!" cried the king. "The Marquis of Carabas is too kind. He has, if I may say so, a most unusual gamekeeper." After the king had thanked Puss many times and presented him with a becoming blue jacket, Puss hurried back to his master. John was very pleased to see him, but a little worried to hear he was supposed to be a marquis. The next day Puss said, "I have another plan. Go down to the river and take a swim by the bridge. Leave the rest to me." "Well," said John, rubbing Puss's ears fondly, "you are such a clever Puss. I will do anything you say." Off John went to the river, with Puss following. When John had undressed and dived in, Puss took his master's clothes and hid them. Just as the cat climbed onto the bridge, there was a sound of hoof-beats and jingling harness. Up drove His Majesty in a fine red coach, with his lovely daughter, the princess, at his side. The horses drew to a snorting halt, for Puss was jumping about in the road, mewling and yowling most horribly. "What is it, gamekeeper Puss?" inquired the king, leaning out of the window. "My master has been robbed," cried Puss. "While he was swimming, thieves came and stole all his clothes." "Meow, meow, alas, the poor marquis!" The king was most concerned, and immediately sent one of his officers back to the palace to fetch the marquis a splendid suit of clothes. Puss ran ahead of the coach until he came to some reapers harvesting a fine cornfield. I know an ogre owns these fields, said Puss, but the king hates ogres. So if he drives this way, tell him the corn belongs to the Marquis of Carabas. Very good, sir, answered the reapers respectfully. Meanwhile, John put on the fine suit the king had sent for. Stepping out into the road, he bowed gracefully. My dear, said his majesty to the princess, what a fine, handsome young man the Marquis is. Turning to John, he added, Come, Marquis, won't you join us in our coach? John accepted gladly, for he had never seen anyone so charming as the princess. The king was a great talker. In fact, he never stopped. But John and the princess, who had fallen very much in love, hardly said anything. The king was delighted with the view. Such rich cornfields, so many fat sheep, such fine cattle and horses grazing on the hills. Funnily enough, whenever he inquired from reapers, shepherds, or herdsmen, to whom do these belong? They all replied, as Puss had taught them, the Marquis of Carabas owns them, your majesty. The Marquis must be immensely wealthy, thought the king, and he ordered his coach to drive to the large castle on the hill overlooking these rich fields. While this was going on, Puss had dashed ahead and reached the castle well in advance. Now in this castle lived a huge bad-tempered ogre, who had stolen it long ago from a rich duke. And what do you want? Growled the ogre when he saw Puss. Ah, Mr. Ogre, replied Puss, trying not to look as frightened as he felt. I have heard you are a marvelous magician, and can turn yourself into anything you choose. The ogre, who was very conceited, liked being told he was marvelous. He immediately began to show off his powers. I'll frighten that little cat, he grunted. Hey, presto! In a flash, an enormous lion stood roaring in his place. Wonderful, stammered clever Puss, his tail as fuzzy as a bottle brush with alarm. But surely it's much harder for a big ogre to turn into something tiny. A mouse, perhaps? The ogre was most annoyed that Puss didn't think him clever. Easy, he said, and lo, there sat a mouse. With one big pounce, Puss killed it. And that is the end of the ogre, he purred. I won't eat him. He might taste nasty. So it was that when the king's coach rumbled over the drawbridge and into the castle courtyard, there was Master Puss waiting at the door. Welcome to the Marquis of Carabas's castle, mewed Puss, bowing politely. The castle was very grand inside, beautifully furnished with fine gold plate on all the tables. All the ogre's vast riches now belonged to John. The king gladly agreed when John and the princess asked him to let them marry. It was the grandest wedding you ever saw, and Puss was the guest of honor. When the king died some years later, John and the princess ruled the land together. John was the finest king the country had had for many years. Puss became a great favorite with the young queen and her children, and John always loved him dearly, valuing him as one of his wisest counselors. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you have a wonderful day.